Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for this Issues and Ideas Forum. We're starting right at noon, right on time. My name is Michael Van Beek. I'm the Director of Research at the Mackinac Center. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to you and also to our audience who's viewing this online on our live web stream. This will be recorded and available later for you to view or to share with friends or family, colleagues, whatever you'd like to do. That's available on our website. Couple of things before we start. I just wanted to make you aware of the publications table that we have out in the place where you signed in there or got your name tag. There's publications for you to look at, and they're free for you if you'd like them. There's also a sign-up sheet for our daily online news source called Michigan Capital Confidential. You could sign up for that, and we'll send you most recent news about interesting things that are happening in Michigan around policy, different policy issues and ideas. Also, for the question and answer section of today's forum, there are cards at your table, and if you have a question for after the presentation, we ask that you just jot that question on the card, and then we'll come around and collect those, and we'll ask questions to our speaker that way. I also want to make a note to thank Auto Owners Insurance for their support. They support these issues and ideas forums that we host in Lansing on a regular basis. Now for our topic and speaker. There aren't many policies that most economists agree on, but one of them is that free trade is a net benefit for society. However, if you paid attention to the 2016 presidential election, which I'm guessing most of you did, it seemed like free trade was under assault from all sides. And with us today, we have a speaker who will talk about why that's the wrong approach and why that's the wrong way to think about free trade. And our speaker is Mark Perry, who is a professor of economics at the Flint campus of the University of Michigan, where he has taught undergraduate and graduate courses in economics and finance since 1996. Starting in the fall of 2009, Mark has also held a joint appointment as a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He holds 2 graduate degrees in economics from George Mason University and an MBA in finance from the University of Minnesota. He serves on the Mackinac Center's Board of Scholars, and he operates a very popular economics blog called Carpe Diem, and I would encourage you to look that up and check it out and subscribe to that because it's an excellent blog that he runs. So with that, please welcome Mark Perry.
Thanks, Mike. And I've been in Michigan for a little over 20 years now, and I've been associated with the Mackinac Center right after I moved here in 1996. So I go way back with our sponsor today, the Mackinac Center. So I would like to talk today about trade, U.S. trade policy and protectionism 101, I called it, and then subtitled Why Trump is Completely Wrong About Trade. And that title came from during the campaign season last year in March of 2016. I had been writing on my blog a lot about trade and why Trump is really wrong and completely clueless, I guess, as one commenter described it, that he's really just so clueless about trade. And so then I was invited by the Los Angeles Times to write an op-ed that they featured last year, and they gave it the title, Trump is Completely Wrong About the U.S. Trade Deficit. So that's kind of the topic today. Now let's see, is this... All right, so let me start with identifying what I think are a series of widespread and widely held, but either false or half-true economic myths about trade. The first one is that exports are good and imports are bad. We hear that all the time. That's actually part of what's been a discredited theory of trade. It's been discredited for 200 years, but it just doesn't seem to go away, and that's the theory of mercantilism that tried to encourage exports and restrain imports. It's been discredited, like I say, for hundreds of years, but we see a resurgence of that now. We also hear about how trade deficits are bad. I think just the word deficit seems like it's negative when it really shouldn't be. It's just an accounting identity. So we hear about trade deficits are bad, and that's a sign of economic weakness. That's not really true, or it's half true. The two most misunderstood and misused economic terms, in at least recently, I think, are the trade deficit and the trade imbalance, because either they don't really exist, or to the extent that they do exist, it's not really significant or important. We hear all the time about how protectionism, usually through tariffs, protective tariffs, that's often necessary to protect domestic industries and domestic jobs, and it can increase national prosperity, income, and wealth. I would argue that that's completely false and not true at all. Then we hear about how trade and trade policy should be viewed, or at least the way it's presented, it's viewed primarily from the viewpoint of domestic producers and their employees, while we ignore the other part of the equation, which are the consumers. Okay, so we'll kind of go through these kind of one at a time here. All right, so if we just start with two very basic economic principles that are pretty much not in dispute. The first is that it's a fact that countries don't engage in trade with each other. Only individual businesses and individual consumers trade. So we hear about a trade deficit with Japan or Canada or Mexico or China as if the two countries are trading, but it's not the case. It's individuals trade, not countries, and that's important because of the second fundamental principle is that when individuals engage in voluntary market trade and market exchanges, that both parties, the buyer and the seller, are always made better off because both parties get something they want. So trade from an economic standpoint, and just a common sense standpoint, is win-win. Both parties win. And yet we hear it from politicians like Trump that it's win-lose, like a baseball game. One team wins, the other team loses. China wins, America loses. That's not really the way to look at it. Or sometimes they even would say that it's lose-lose, that both parties lose. But if we assume that trade is win-win, and then we add up all those win-win transactions and then come up with the trade deficit number, then it's really going to be hard to argue that that's somehow negative when every transaction that went into that calculation was a win-win outcome. Okay, so on the campaign trail, we heard all the time from Trump about how the greatest theft in the history of the world, we're getting ripped off, crushed, hosed, and killed on trade with China and Mexico and Japan, and they're, oh yeah, okay, and that they're, laughing at us as they beat us up economically. We heard that all the time in various, different formats. So to understand how really backward that is, imagine if Trump was standing with a megaphone in the parking lot of a Walmart or a Home Depot or a Best Buy, and he was shouting to American consumers as they're leaving with their merchandise, hey, you just got absolutely crushed by those merchants who sold you cheap products made in China, Japan, and Mexico, and these people overseas now are laughing at you. That would just be ridiculous, that the consumers who voluntarily purchased those products and who said thank you to the cashier as they left, and while the cashier said thank you to them, so it was like the double thank you at the end of the transaction, that they bought that merchandise and they selected that merchandise because they valued the goods that they were purchasing more than the dollars they left behind. The Home Depot, they don't want the merchandise. They want to get rid of the merchandise and convert it into cash. We want to get rid of our cash and get the merchandise. All right, so politicians like Trump and his advisors, they love to focus on the trade deficit. We hear a lot about that, as if that was some kind of scorecard of who's winning and who's losing in global trade. But the real measure of economic activity is the total volume of trade, not just looking at exports and imports, but looking at the total volume of trade and the number of transactions that take place. That's what's really important from an economic standpoint, because as economies expand and grow, so does trade, and both imports and exports grow as the economy, like the U.S. economy, grows. Exports help U.S. companies reach new markets and expand economies of scale. They can produce at higher levels of output, while imports bless U.S. consumers and U.S. firms with lower prices and more choices, promotes competition, innovation, and efficiency gains among producers. So this, so since all of the voluntary exchanges are win-win, whether it's an export transaction or an import transaction, and whether you visited a foreign country on vacation or a foreign tourist visited the United States, that really shouldn't the goal be, and so all of those transactions have a satisfied buyer and satisfied seller, so really shouldn't the goal be is to maximize the amount of trade and exchange that takes place, whether it's on the same side of an artificial line called a national border or on two different sides of an artificial line, an imaginary line in a sense. So often when the Bureau of Economic Analysis reports the monthly trade statistics, and they always report exports and imports and the trade deficit, what I do, and a few other people do this, is add up exports plus imports to look at the total volume of international trade that took place in the United States, taking exports and imports and adding them together. And so you can see, of course, during the Great Recession, a huge drop in total trade, and then it recovered, and now it's kind of up and down. It depends on the value of the dollar and other things. But we're now close to an all-time high in terms of our level of total trade. And then here's the other thing that we never hear about, because there's merchandise trade for goods, and there's also trade for services. Services, for the U.S., we have a huge and growing services trade surplus. So we never hear about that. We only hear about the trade deficit for merchandise. And so this is showing, this is adjusted for inflation, so America's trade surplus for services has increased 3 times in about the last 10 years. So services would include tourism. So more people visit here than we visit other countries. It includes education. So more people come here to go to colleges and universities than Americans go to other countries. It includes insurance, financial services, engineering, advertising, architecture services, all of those services where, according to Trump, I guess, we're crushing our trade partners and we're laughing as we steal their jobs for higher education or whatever it is. So again, that's the other thing that we never hear about, is our large and growing trade surplus for our services. Now, how important is international trade to each U.S. state's economy? Well, it's pretty important for many states. In fact, Michigan, I did this analysis recently, Michigan has the most highly globalized state economy of any U.S. state. And this is looking at the total amount of economic output in each state here in 2015, and then looking at exports plus imports in and out of the state, and then looking at what share this international trade component is of the total amount of the state's economic activity. For Michigan, it's 38%, because there's a lot of car parts coming in and a lot of finished cars going out to Canada and other places. And Louisiana, also more than a third of their economy is because of international trade, oil and gas and their location. And then a lot of these other countries, think of South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Texas, and Georgia. A lot of the reason that their state economy is highly globalized is because of the automotive industry. That again, states like South Carolina and Georgia, they're taking in car parts and building cars and then shipping cars out. So the automotive sector is highly globalized, and Michigan actually leads the nation. So if we think about disrupting trade, whether it's by getting rid of NAFTA or imposing tariffs, the Michigan economy would be very vulnerable to any kind of reduction or restrictions on international trade. And then how important is international trade to America's largest firms? Well, this is a table. These are the 100 largest. This is data from the United Nations, and it's the world's 100 largest multinational corporations. And of that 100, these are the ones that are based in the United States. And what I wanted to highlight here was this column here, which is the percent of U.S. companies' sales that are outside of the United States. So look at Apple, for example, and 65%, almost 2/3 of their sales are outside of the United States. So they're producing and selling in a global economy. And so that's why when Trump and other politicians start hectoring and criticizing Apple for producing some of their products outside of the country, from a business standpoint, if 2/3 of their market is outside of this country, it would make sense that at least 2/3 or maybe even more of their production should be outside of this country, because they're selling a lot of iPhones in Asia and China and Thailand and India and maybe even in Europe. And so it would make sense for them. And a lot of these companies, quite a few of these companies, have more than half of their sales outside of the United States. So they're multinational corporations, and they're making decisions on production and sales based on what makes sense from a business and economic standpoint. So again, if we start disrupting trade or start forcing companies to change their production locations, it could really have negative consequences for the U.S. economy. And then are imports really so bad? We always have this mercantilist thinking about imports are bad, exports are a lot better. But this is the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They break all of the imports coming in into 5 major, what they call end-use categories. And the first one is capital goods. I'll kind of explain these in a minute. And then there's industrial supplies is another big component. And then they group cars and parts and engines together. So some of those are finished cars, but a lot of that is going to be parts and engines coming in for production or assembly in the United States, and then there's food. So if we think about this, so last year in 2016, the imports of capital goods, and again, so these are all imports that are being used as inputs for U.S. companies. So capital goods would be machinery, equipment, aircraft, semiconductors, engines, tractors, and so on. And then the other category of industrial equipment, lumber, chemicals, metals like aluminum and copper, iron and steel, cotton and wool, plastics and fuels. And then if you add car parts and engines together, that those three categories accounted for a lot more than 50% of the total imports coming into the country. So it's an important point that more than half of what enters the U.S. as an import are orders from U.S. companies, often Michigan manufacturers and other manufacturers around the country, automakers, for the equipment and supplies and raw materials and car parts that they need as direct inputs into the production process that takes place in American factories and businesses that employ millions of American workers. And even the imports of finished consumer goods, like clothing and footwear and electronic goods, or automobiles and food products, could also be considered as inputs or intermediate goods, because we don't order those as consumers. Like Amazon doesn't deliver from China. We have to go to a U.S. store. And so those are intermediate goods for U.S. companies like retailers, like imported clothing that's sold at Target, or avocados sold at Meijer, or Toyotas sold here at the local Toyota dealer, Spartan Toyota. So rising imports, whether it's foreign-produced steel for GM or more clothing for Target, are a sign of economic strength and not a sign of economic weakness, as we hear so much about. So again, if you think of the competitiveness of the U.S. companies, like Michigan automakers, that the lower the price of inputs, whether they're sourced domestically or internationally, the more competitive those companies can be, the more of their products they can sell, both at home and abroad, the greater market share they can achieve, the greater profitability they can earn, and then the more U.S. workers they can hire. In contrast, the higher the prices of imported inputs, let's say through 20 or 30% tariffs on products coming in from Mexico or China, then the less competitive U.S. companies are going to be, the fewer workers they're going to hire. So just keep that in mind the next time you hear Trump or other politicians talk about creating more jobs by making imported imports more expensive, by imposing double-digit tariffs, as he's promised to do on goods from Mexico and China, or recently now on lumber from Canada. Now, why are trade deficits considered bad? Again, the word deficit just implies something negative. Surplus sounds a lot better. Deficit, like attention deficit disorder, it sounds like something bad when it really isn't. But a trade deficit, by definition, is when the imports or purchases of foreign-produced goods are greater than the exports or our sales of goods to foreigners. Now, we can think of it that most of us, for our entire lives, are going to have a trade deficit with our local grocery store, whether it's Meijer or Kroger, whatever it is. Because if you're spending $100 a week on groceries from your local grocer, and they never buy any of your products or goods or services, you would have a continual ongoing trade deficit with your grocery store for your entire life. And none of us would ever think that that was a bad outcome, to have a trade deficit with your grocery store. And the important point here is that trade deficits are offset by what are called financial investment surpluses, or capital surpluses, or actually capital inflows into the country. And in fact, an economist recently described it like this. I thought this was very interesting, that what we want to look at is the total inflow and outflow of dollars through the numerous pipes that make up the plumbing of U.S. commerce with the rest of the world. So there's cash going out and cash coming in, and that the cash inflows and cash outflows have to balance at the end of the month or at the end of the quarter, and I'll explain why. So, but the balance of payments always has to balance at zero, because again, it's like a balance sheet. The balance sheet has to balance, the balance of payments has to balance. So here's a simple way to understand it, because it gets complicated when there's billions of dollars of trade transactions. But just think of a simple example. Only 2 transactions take place, and we want to account for this with balance of payments account. A U.S. consumer buys a $1,000 TV from Japan with U.S. dollars, and that's the only transaction that takes place for goods. That'd be a cash outflow of $1,000 for merchandise it would also then be categorized as a trade deficit of $1,000 because we bought more from them than they bought from us. But now the Japanese investor, there's $1,000 in Japan. Again, there's a pipe going over and a pipe coming back. So now there's $1,000 in US dollars that comes back into the country, and a Japanese investor buys a corporate bond or some stocks in the United States for $1,000. Now there's a cash inflow of $1,000 for financial assets. That's the other part of the international trade equation that we never hear about, is financial assets. There's trade for goods, services, and financial assets. So the balance of payments accounting would be that basically you have $1,000 going out and $1,000 coming back in. And so the trade is balanced. There's no trade imbalance. There's no deficit or imbalance. Once we account for all of the international transactions, that would include goods and financial assets. So again, we never hear about that, about the offsetting capital inflow that offsets the trade deficit. Okay, so Trump, we hear a lot about how he thinks trade deficits are bad, but on the other hand, he welcomes foreign investment into the United States. Economist Don Boudreaux at George Mason said, to lament American trade deficits is to lament the fact that foreigners are investing in America. Because for every $1 of trade deficit is a $1 of cash inflow or capital inflow into American financial assets, foreign direct investment, building factories in the United States, or buying our financial assets. So the trade deficits are always offset on a dollar-for-dollar basis with what I have called capital-creating, job-generating foreign investment surpluses. So in a way, it's kind of silly because we get a net inflow of goods coming into the country with the trade deficit. We also get a net inflow of capital investment coming into the country, more capital coming in than going out, more goods coming in than going out, and then we complain. We end up with the goods. You know, if you look at who ends up with the goods and who ends up with the financial investment capital, it's the U.S. And here's how we can think of it, you know, just graphically, again, just by balance of payments accounting, that here's looking back over 20 or 30 years, I guess 30 years or more, looking at the trade deficit as it gets reported every year. And then that is exactly offset by a foreign investment surplus. So there's a cash inflow for U.S. financial assets, a cash outflow for goods and services. But that has to balance. So in the end, the balance of payments is zero. There's no trade imbalance. So we hear all the time about a trade imbalance when really, if we look at the complete picture, there's no trade imbalance. The trade balances. Again, thinking of the pipes going in and out and the plumbing of international commerce. Now, what about tariffs? Trump was big on this. He might not be able to get this through because I don't think he can unilaterally, you know, just start imposing tariffs. But he talked about 30 to 40% tariffs on goods from Mexico and China. Now, we recently imposed 20% lumber tariffs. Not Trump, but under Obama last year, we had 266% tariffs on Chinese steel. So think about a tariff. It seems like it might be different, but it really is just a tax. It's a tax. It's just like a sales tax on imports. There's no difference at all between a tariff and a tax. Now, who pays sales taxes when you go and buy merchandise at Target? Well, we pay the sales tax as consumers. So who pays tariffs? Americans pay the tariffs. So will punitive tariffs punish Mexico and Canadians, China, or Americans? So we always talk about, well, we're going to punish Canada or punish Mexico or punish Chinese steel makers, but they don't pay the tariff. The tariff is paid once an import comes into the country, and it's paid by an American company generally, and then those costs are passed on to American consumers. So acting as if we're going to penalize China or Mexico or Canada with tariffs, it really is completely not true. We penalize ourselves. We pay the tariffs. We pay the taxes. And a tariff is like a tax. So again, anytime you hear about tariffs, think of tax, and then think about those taxes that are imposed on American companies and businesses. So we can, again, do a quick kind of explanation of protectionism with what's called public choice theory to kind of just understand, you know, because basically, you know, Thomas Sowell said it best, and he said that the first lesson of economics is that we live in a universe of scarcity. And when you live in a universe of scarcity, you have to be concerned about economic efficiency. So he said the first lesson of economics is that we live in a universe of scarcity. The first lesson of politics is to ignore the first lesson of economics. So once you go from economics, where resource allocation and efficiency is primary, into the fantasy world of politics, then you deviate from what would be the best outcome from an economic standpoint, which is really the ultimate way to think about these kinds of outcomes. So if we think about protectionism, trade protection, and I'll go through an example with U.S. sugar tariffs, the benefits are, of course, to the protected domestic producers who are now protected against more efficient or lower cost foreign rivals. All right, and so it's concentrated on very well organized, well-funded special interest groups like the sugar beet farmers. And those benefits are immediate if they can impose the tariff. And they're also very visible, that you can see the jobs that might have been saved or created because of tariffs. But then on the other side, there's always costs and benefits. That's why we concentrate on all those benefits, but we ignore the other side, which are the costs. The costs to consumers are going to be dispersed among very large groups, hundreds of millions of consumers who are very disorganized. They don't have any, trade association or kind of grassroots organization to represent consumers on issues like this. It's going to be very long-term costs, and they're going to be largely invisible. So everybody in this room pays higher costs for any time you buy sugar or buy anything with sugar in it, and yet nobody really would know that you're all paying higher costs for sugar because of trade protection. And the reason that that's a good example is because we can get a daily measure of how much those protective tariffs or trade restrictions, quotas, because we basically don't allow, we allow very little foreign sugar to come into the U.S. market. And every day in the futures markets, they have two contracts. One is for sugar at the world price, and one is for sugar at the domestic price. So you can see here in a recent quote, the world price of sugar was about 14 cents a pound when you're buying, again, 100,000 pounds. The U.S. price of sugar was almost twice that amount, about 28 cents a pound. So we pay, and that's been going on for almost ever. And this is showing historically the U.S. price of sugar averaging almost 30 cents a pound over the last 25 years or so compared to the world price, and they fluctuate up and down. The world price has been about 12 cents. So we've had these trade protection for the U.S. sugar beet farmers, and so we can kind of analyze this here. So the sugar beet and sugarcane farmers are very well organized. They're the ones that are protected and get the benefit of the trade protection. But now you've got the sugar-using companies, the candy companies and so on, candy and ice cream companies, and their shareholders and their employees. And then you have the American consumers who are buying sugar and sugar-containing products, we pay about $3 billion a year in higher sugar prices because of the tariffs, but that's hidden and invisible, and people don't know that. So the sugar tariffs, of course, benefit the sugar beet farmers, but they harm the other two groups. And in fact, found this article from 2002, and it says Lifesavers takes their business to Canada over sugar cost. And this was from Holland, Michigan, where they had 600 people at a plant there. Lifesavers are 99% sugar. So the Kraft Foods moved the factory from Michigan. We lost 600 jobs in the state because they could move to Canada and get sugar at half the price and then maybe still sell that Lifesavers here or around the world. So then that's the group that loses out. And so we know from international trade theory and empirical evidence tells us that the cost imposed on those second two groups in the form of higher cost, higher prices, and the loss of jobs, like the Michigan jobs that were lost because of sugar tariffs, that's always greater than the benefits to the first group, meaning that we're always going to be worse off on net as a country, looking at all the costs and all the benefits. So there is no economic justification for trade protectionism. There's only political considerations that explain its popularity and the fact that the first group is more politically powerful and connected than the second two groups. And here's, again, let's look at the empirical evidence. This goes back to the 80s, but it was like 31 case studies of trade protection in the United States in different industries. And so what they're looking at here is the consumer losses in millions of dollars per year and the producer gains in millions of dollars per year. So for sugar, the producers gain $550 million, but the consumers lose almost $1 billion a year. Again, this was back in '86 in the form of higher prices. And for automobile, again, this is going back in the 70s and 80s when there might have been tariffs or restrictions on Japanese cars, whatever it was, that the producers gain $2.6 billion a year, but it costs consumers $5.8 billion. So it's not a good trade-off if you're if you're imposing cost of 5.8 and only getting benefits of 2.6. And then this last column is the annual consumer losses per job saved. And then I've adjusted for inflation to bring this into today's dollars. And so on average, trade protection costs the US economy over $500,000 per year for every one job saved. So again, that's not a good trade-off from an economic standpoint to spend $500,000 to save one job. It'd be much cheaper to pay that person's full salary and benefits from some kind of fund and just allow the imports to come in, compared to restricting imports, and then it's costing the US economy $500,000 in today's dollars to save one job in a protected industry. All right, so I'm kind of coming to the end here, and we can take some questions. But this was, 4 days before his death in 1850, the kind of French economist, famous French economist, Frederic Bastiat, sent this message to his friend, and I've used this quote quite often because I think it's an important concept and idea. And he said that you should treat all economic questions, including international trade, from the viewpoint of the consumer, for the interest of the consumer or the interest of the human race. So that's what gets completely neglected when we talk about lumber tariffs. All we talk about are the lumber jobs in the lumber industry. We don't talk about, how much it's going to cost in the form of higher prices for houses. When we talk about steel tariffs, we only talk about, the jobs we save in the steel industry. We don't talk about all the jobs that are lost or the higher cost for General Motors because they buy a lot of steel. Now it's going to be a higher price. So they can employ fewer workers, and higher prices get passed on to consumers. And then also, if we think of, kind of the moral case outside of economics or outside of politics especially, what about the moral case for free trade and the moral case against protectionism? This is also from Bastiat, who was the one that he called it legal plunder. Today, I guess we'd call it crony capitalism. But he said, well, how do you identify legal plunder? And he said, well, see if the laws, and in this case we're talking about protectionism for sugar farmers, let's say, see if the laws take from some person what belongs to them, American consumers and American business owners, and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong, the domestic producers, and then see if the law benefits one group of citizens, the domestic sugar beet farmers in the sugar case, at the expense of others, the consumers and business owners who buy sugar, by doing what the citizens themselves, the domestic producers, cannot do without committing a crime, which would be to pick the pockets of the American consumers with protectionism. That they couldn't do that legally, to steal from all of us $5 a year for higher sugar prices, but they can do it indirectly by using the political process. And so this, again, if you even think about, kind of the moral implications of protectionism, I think you could make a case that it's really then allowing domestic producers to engage in legal plunder. Okay, then to kind of summarize the main points here, that to kind of keep in mind, as you hear, we're going to be debating this for years now, that trade is win-win. It's not win-lose, according to Trump. Again, it's not like a baseball game or a football game, Michigan State versus Michigan. In this case, when trade, both parties win. And again, it doesn't matter if they're on the same side of an imaginary line called a national border and it's two Michigans trading, or it doesn't matter, I just was in Italy for 2 weeks and went on the other side of an imaginary line, and I was completely satisfied with my vacation in Italy. So trade is win-win, not lose-lose. And then people trade, not countries. That countries don't go on vacation. Individuals go on vacation. And when if you think about trade another way, that would you want any restrictions placed on where you could travel on vacation? Would you want some kind of tariff imposed on you if you decided to visit, Europe or Asia? I don't think we would stand for that we would like to have access to the globe when we want to decide where we want to travel and go on vacation. So again, it's people traveling, not countries. The U.S. doesn't travel to Canada. Individual peoples decide they want to go to Canada for vacation or for shopping or whatever. And Canadians decide they want to come here. The trade deficits are not necessarily bad, and there really are no trade imbalances once we account for all of the trade transactions, all of the pipes, again, the plumbing. It always balances. Cheap imports, both inputs for U.S. companies and finished goods. If we buy, most of the clothing we're wearing was probably produced outside of the country. Just check your tags sometime on your clothing in your wardrobe. So cheap imports, both inputs for companies and finished goods for consumers, provide great value for U.S. firms and households and consumers. Tariffs are just simply taxes, and they're paid for by American firms, and so they punish U.S. firms because they're the ones that have to pay them. Canada doesn't pay our tariffs. Remember, when the good comes into the country, there's a tariff on it. It's paid for by an American citizen, an American company. So tariffs are taxes paid by Americans, and they punish us. We're imposing tariffs on ourselves or raising taxes on ourselves. Protectionism always has to make a country worse off, not better off, when we consider all the costs and all the benefits. So it's a form of self-imposed economic poison that makes the country worse off. And when you hear Trump talk about trade, he'll only present the case for the U.S. producers and their workers, and never the U.S. consumer or the companies that use lumber, for example. And so what he's advocating is really a form of crony capitalism for domestic producers at the expense of American consumers, U.S. firms, and U.S. households. And then also there could be, I guess the bottom part got cut off, but there's a moral case against protectionism as a form of legal plunder and allowing legalized theft of consumers by U.S. producers. So that concludes my comments, and be happy to spend a little time that we have left here for some questions. All right, thank you.
All right, and just as a reminder, there are the cards at your table. If you got a question, jot it down, and we'll collect them, and then I'll ask them of Mark. Since I have a microphone, I will ask the first one. So on the imports, foreign countries buying, or us buying goods from foreign countries, leading to their investment in U.S. financial assets. Is it it's possible, though, that a country could potentially sell us a bunch of stuff, but then not invest in the U.S., right? Is that, I mean, that's a possibility. Is that happening at all with any countries? Is that something to be concerned about?
Yeah, well, what would happen is, let's say that we buy more goods from China than they buy from us, and so now there's a net outflow of dollars in China. Now, so they have a choice. They can spend those dollars back in the U.S. on our goods or our services or our investment. But let's say that they decided they'd rather invest in India or Thailand or Europe. Well, then they would take those dollars that they're holding, that's excess dollars, the outflow of U.S. dollars that has ended up in China. Now, if they would just hold on to those pieces of paper, that would be the best of all possible worlds, because we can print more green pieces of paper with dead presidents' pictures and send them green paper if they'll send us their goods. But they're not going to be that foolish. They're going to either take those dollars and spend them back here, or if they decide they don't want to spend the dollars back here, they'll sell the dollars, and the dollars will go into the foreign exchange market, and somebody else will buy those dollars. So the dollars move around, and so maybe it's that on net, our trade deficit results in a capital inflow of foreign investment, but it doesn't always have to match up perfectly with which countries we have goods deficits with. That those don't necessarily have to be the same countries that are investing here, because the dollars go into the foreign exchange market, which is the largest financial market. $5 trillion worth of currency gets traded every day. So if they didn't want to invest here, somebody else would.
Okay, here's a question about a particular instance of an impact of international trade. Thinking about Flint, which you know quite a bit about. GM's employment there is down 90%, according to this question. And Flint's in bad shape. And is that a result of free trade? Should we consider the city of Flint a loser for free trade?
Well, I think that it's stabilized now, and of course there were a lot of jobs lost, but I think the point would be you can have job losses in a community for a lot of different reasons. It's the whole idea of creative destruction, as the economist Joseph Schumpeter called it, the innovation that leads to disruption. So think of what's going on right now within the United States, the battle between Uber and Lyft and the ride-sharing services and traditional taxi cartels that used to have a cartel in a sense because they had restricted entry with taxi medallions. Okay, so now there's a lot of taxi drivers that are losing their livelihood. There's people that a few years ago in New York, you'd paid $1 million for a medallion to operate one taxi cab in Manhattan. Okay, now they report sales every month that has dropped from $1 million to now 200,000. So somebody who just bought a medallion 3 or 4 years ago and paid $1 million, now they're losing business. So again, that would create a huge amount of disruption and dislocation because taxi drivers now are going to lose the value of their license. They're going to possibly lose their job. So that wasn't any kind of disruption from outside of the country. That was an internal form of disruption. And so again, when you think of the loss of manufacturing jobs, whether it's in Flint or in Michigan or in the country, the biggest loss of manufacturing jobs really hasn't been from foreign competition or outsourcing. It's because of technology. So when you think about all the welding that used to be done by hand, now it's all done robotically. That's what led to the jobs bank in Michigan, is because of technology is really what displaced quite a few American manufacturing workers. And so Flint, had a rough period, but again, and the alternatives are to allow kind of that disruption and then try to have new, retraining, or to protect the industries. And so let's say we could have protected Flint with not allowing foreign competition, then it would have made everybody else in the country a little bit worse off, and it would have destroyed jobs elsewhere. So again, it's always that trade-off between cost and benefits, and when you have a city that's kind of concentrated and undiversified in one industry, then Flint had a rough period. Now I would say it's stabilized and it's actually kind of coming back. Well, the water problem kind of was another setback. But yeah, so it's tragic in a way, but again, Flint, when it started, it put all the horse and buggy manufacturers out of business because that was an innovation, automobiles and engines, internal combustion engine. So, the tractor eliminated millions of jobs in farming. So, there's that force that's always going to be going and leading to changes in the economy. So, yeah, Flint had a rough time, and hopefully now it's stabilized and coming back.
This question is about NAFTA. So, what's your opinion about NAFTA, and how does it fit into kind of this, your presentation and your presentation about free trade?
Yeah, I think trade deals are always a little bit tricky because if you just really want free trade, why do you need a 1,000-page agreement? Why not just open the borders? So NAFTA, I think in general, has had a net positive effect on the economy. And now, recently when Trump talked about trying to get tough with Mexico or something, I don't think he even realized that basically our goods going into Mexico, really the tariffs are almost zero. So we really have a free access to the Mexican market. And in fact, when he started talking about tearing up NAFTA or renegotiating it, the U.S. farm industry got mobilized pretty quickly because a lot of our farm products go to Mexico, and they didn't want any kind of disruption because they're already getting access. So there are almost no tariffs on goods going between Canada and U.S. and Mexico. So, perhaps it's almost 20 years old, or I guess it is 20 years old now. So maybe it's time to renegotiate parts of it, but I think in general it's been a benefit for Michigan, it's been a benefit for the United States, and it really has allowed us greater access to Canada and to Mexico, especially for farm products, and has been a net positive for the U.S. So I would hope we kind of go cautiously on any kind of tearing up NAFTA.
One of the things that you didn't talk specifically about, but is I think a strategy that's been discussed for dealing with this trade deficit issue is border adjustment taxes. What's your opinion of those and how they work and what kind of impact they would have?
Yeah, well, I guess I don't think that's going to get too far. I think it's a complicated. People don't quite understand it. There's a tax specialist who I work with at American Enterprise Institute, Alan Viard, and he's written about it quite a bit. And so, I guess it was somehow going to assume that the value of the dollar adjusted so it wouldn't have much effect, and then there was going to have some effect on corporate taxes. But it just seems, again, like that seemed too complicated and too convoluted and might have, they can never anticipate all of the consequences. That's one of the problems when we pass political legislation, is that you can never anticipate all of the real-world complications and secondary effects. So I don't think that's got any political traction right now in Washington. I hope probably is going to be dead. And so, again, Alan Viard is the one who really knew about that in great detail, and I kind of have just kind of a surface knowledge of the border adjustment tax, but it seems like that's died off for now and won't be an issue.
So here's a question that looks at this trade issue a little bit differently. Is it good? Is free trade good for the U.S. if the products that we're getting from foreign countries seem to be of inferior quality? Is that a problem? Is that a concern? Are we sort of being swindled by these cheap products that are getting dumped into our country?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, if you go to Home Depot and look at the tools and all the products they have, most of them are from China. And so you don't hear a lot of complaints about hammers breaking or whatever. But I guess, I'm old enough to remember back in the 50s and 60s when Japan started exporting products to the United States, and they had a reputation that everything from Japan was supposed to be cheap and inferior to American technology and American production. And maybe that's the level they started at, but now, in terms of their automotive production, they're kind of at the top in terms of quality. I mean, now they're competing very successful. I mean, American companies are competing against them. But there was a time, maybe in the 80s, when it was then recognized that Japanese automotive quality was much higher than American auto quality. So maybe if we're in the initial stages of, China's just starting their economic engine, they've been asleep for a long time because of controls on the market. That maybe that they will improve and that they will, over time, increase their level of quality. And so it could just be they're starting out now. But again, it seems like, I don't know if people automatically assume if it's made in China that it's inferior, but I guess there is some truth to that. But again, maybe that's just a learning issue and they're getting better with their quality of manufacturing.
Regarding sugar and artificially high sugar prices that we pay here, is there a massive market for illegal sugar that you're aware of? And if there isn't one, why not? If there is, what does it look like?
I mean, usually, yeah, we think about what's called the law of one price. I mean, like gold has to sell at the same price in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, because if it was lower in one country and higher in another, people would buy low and sell high and make arbitrage profits. In fact, they say there's more cigarette smuggling now in New York, in the state of New York or the city of New York, than drug smuggling because, again, the cigarette taxes make the cigarettes so high that now they smuggle them in from other states. And again, if you can get sugar in Canada at half the price as it is here, then you would think there could potentially be a black market for sugar. But I guess the problem would be, unlike drugs that might be fairly compact, it might be hard to get a train car load full of sugar across the border. So maybe it's just, yeah, I mean, it could have something to do with that too. Yeah, so I guess you don't hear too much about sugar smuggling, but there could potentially be a market when you have two prices, the world price and anytime you have two prices, because if you have two prices, you have a high price and a low price. So if you can buy at the low price and sell at the high price, people will have an incentive to do that, like with cigarettes in the state of New York or city of New York. But with sugar, I'm not sure there's a black market for that.
Well, one of the impacts of the higher sugar prices is it created incentives for American corn growers to use a lot of their cornfields to grow, purpose their corn for high fructose corn syrup, which I don't know the science behind any of it, but a lot of people are concerned about the health effects of that. And so that, that's another sort of side effect of these kinds of protectionism.
Yeah, and I'm sure when they're thinking about legislation, they never think that far ahead and think all the complications and the secondary effects, the long-term effects, and they probably never really anticipated that in any way when they crafted the legislation, which really I think goes back, I think we've had sugar tariffs almost as long as America has been a country, so there's a long history of sugar protection, and that's why, I guess that's another kind of critique of trade protection is once it's in place, it's very hard to get rid of it. I mean, now that the sugar beet farmers are protected and they're mobilized and they engage in rent seeking and lobbying, and then it's very difficult, even though people have tried and legislators have tried, it's very difficult to end the sugar protection. So it's become sweet deal for the sugar producers and a sugar racket. Big sugar, I guess, is what we could call it.
So some people claim that protectionist nations are growing more quickly than nations that are broadly free trade. Is that true? Are your theories right, but maybe irrelevant to today's world?
Well, I mean, it could be that if you look at economic growth and look at China, for example, they are growing much more rapidly than we are, but they're starting at a much lower base. And so you can get much higher growth rates for income, wages, economic output, GDP, when you're starting at a low base. So China's been growing faster than the U.S., and if they have a more protectionist economy than we do, then you might assume that there's a connection there. But even with China's growth, they're still about 100 years behind the United States looking at GDP per capita, that their GDP on a per capita basis is about the same as it was in the United States about 100 years ago. So, they're growing rapidly, but they have a long way to go, and so that I don't know. And then you would have to think of, well, they're growing at 8% now with trade protection. If they ended trade protection, maybe they could grow at 10%. So there also would be that consideration.
Does this theory of free trade depend on the ability of labor to be mobile?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. To a certain degree, that is a consideration because labor is not as mobile as capital is. So that could be a consideration. I don't know if that would necessarily mean that then there should be some protectionism as a result of that because, and I guess it would also, although I guess it could also be the case that, labor is high here because of the, if we had complete labor mobility and had open borders with Mexico, then there'd be a lot of Mexican workers coming here and trying to find jobs in the United States, and that could put downward pressure on our wages. So, yeah, I guess labor mobility does fit into the whole picture of trade, but I'm not sure that labor immobility would necessarily then justify any kind of protectionism that could end up making the entire economy better off. It makes some workers better off, but not all workers, and on net, not the entire economy.
Okay, I got a couple more here. This one is asking, I think about what happens when, or how should the U.S. respond if other countries put tariffs on our goods coming into their countries? Shouldn't we respond? Shouldn't we reciprocate?
Well, I guess that's the whole, the logic would be then, if they're going to shoot themselves in the foot, we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot to retaliate. So, if they're imposing tariffs and harming their own people, then it wouldn't make sense for us to retaliate and hurt American people because Canada's hurting Canadians. So I guess that whole retaliation thing, it's always kind of like, yeah, okay, you're going to make your country worse off, so we're going to make our country worse off to show you that we can do the same thing. I guess in that case, it wouldn't make sense to retaliate against our own people because they're impoverishing their people. We don't want to impoverish our own people to retaliate. See, that's the kind of twisted logic we get into in trade, where we kind of really move away from sound economic and logical principles into this world where we think like that about retaliation. But we have to kind of think through it a little bit more deeply, I guess.
Okay, good. And this is a great question to end on. The person says, the outcomes of laws and policies on the economy aren't always clear to, when they're initially proposed or by the name of the bill, maybe. So what are some good rules of thumb to keep in mind when assessing new policies or voting for politicians who espouse certain policies?
Yeah, well, I think in general, we should, I would say from an economic standpoint, support politicians who are supporting free trade or against protectionism. And then I guess in terms of, kind of policy, thinking about policies, again, if you think of, especially with trade, how is this going to affect the American consumer? Is that going to make them better off or worse off? And often, you know, the low income or middle income America are the ones that would suffer the most if we impose tariffs on China, let's say, or Mexico, because then the cost of food would go up, the cost of clothing would go up, and lower income people spend a greater share of their income on food and clothing. Okay, so I guess again, when you hear about Trump and lumber tariffs or, you know, milk restrictions or whatever it is we're having, that then we always have to think of, you know, not what's best for Wisconsin dairy farmers or for loggers in Oregon, but what's best for consumers across the entire country, and how are they going to be affected? How are higher prices going to affect them? How is that going to affect jobs outside? Because, you know, as an example, with the lumber tariffs, it'll of course help lumber producers, but the National Association of Home Builders says that if the 20% tariffs stay in effect through the end of the year, it's going to cost something like 8,000 jobs in the construction industry and add $3,500 to the cost of a new home. So again, we have to think about the consumer side as well as the producer side, and the voice of the producer is always louder than the voice of the consumer. So I guess that would be my advice.
All right, very good. Join me in thanking Mark again.
All right, thank you very much. All right, good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all again for attending today. If you have extra questions for Mark, I'm sure he'll be able to stick around for a couple of minutes and answer them for you. Just a reminder, we have another one of these events next week, one week from today on May 18th. The title of that talk is From the Model T to Driverless Cars, How Michigan Can Lead in Transportation Innovation. And that's going to be at the House Office Building in the Mackinac Room at noon on May 18. So we hope to see you there. And if you can't make it, tune into our live stream of that event as well. So thanks again for coming. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.